So this brings us to the last portion. We're going to talk about the major evidence for evolution. So what are the key pieces of evidence, scientific evidence that we have that support this idea of evolution? So we have four main lines of evidence for evolution. You should be able to describe and explain those lines of evidence and how they support this idea of the theory of evolution and natural selection. All right, so our four main lines of scientific evidence. We have direct observations. We've documented this happening in real time. Homologous structures. There's evidence in the fossil record, and we have evidence based on the science of biogeography. All right, so direct observations. There have been thousands of studies that have been published that show changes in species over time when the environment changes, right? In fact, Darwin's finches that he's famous for are still being studied today, and there have been several studies that have been published on those species changing throughout time, right? But let's take this one just as a quick example. So what we're looking at here is this little bug right here. It's called the soapberry bug, and it feeds on the seeds of fruit. Okay, this is a balloon vine fruit right here. So what it does, it takes its little beak, it has a little beak, it sticks it into the fruit, and it finds the seed that's embedded in the fruit, and it basically eats the seed through its little beak. Okay. So in one region of Florida, this native balloon vine still exists. The soapberry bug eats off of that native balloon vine. In another area of Florida, in central Florida, this native balloon vine no longer is it's not very common anymore. Instead, a different species called the golden rain tree has been introduced. The soapberry bug can feed on that golden rain tree though, okay? So what scientists were interested in is that this kind of set up a natural experiment for these scientists. We have one group that has still living in a very similar environment to its ancestors. We have another group of this species that's living in an environment that's different than its ancestors. And there were museum specimens of these insects for which they could use to get a starting point. Okay, so the beak that these soapberry bugs use to eat the seeds, it was hypothesized that the beak length would be different in those members of the population that are feeding on the golden rain tree as opposed to those that are feeding on the balloon vine. And the reason why they thought that this would be different was because the seeds in the balloon vine are a little bit deeper down in the flesh of the fruit than they are in the rain tree. Okay, in the golden rain tree, the seeds are closer to the surface of the skin of the fruit. Okay, so they took a bunch of observations and they measured the length of that beak of the soapberry bug that are eating on the balloon vine, that native species. Okay, so here's what we have. Here's a histogram of the beak length of the soapberry bugs eating on that balloon vine. Okay, so we see that the average beak length is probably right around here, I would guess. Okay, and then they looked at the population that was eating on the golden rain tree, and they measured the average beak length of those individuals. Okay, and their average is probably right around here, I would guess. Okay, again, this is millimeters of the beak length. And then they compared that to the historical average based on the average beak length of the museum specimens that were collected. Okay. So what we see is that in this population down here that lived in central Florida that is no longer feeding on that native balloon vine, the environment has changed, its food source has changed. And so we actually see a shift in this population towards a shorter beak length. Okay, because again, in those golden rain trees, the seeds are a little bit closer to the surface. So if you have a really long beak, you might even pass that seed. You wouldn't even hit that seed, you might go past it, right? So those individuals that had slightly shorter beaks were able to feed on this introduced species, the golden rain tree, better than those that had a longer beak. Okay, so shorter beak, you're more likely to get the seeds out of the golden rain tree, which means you're more likely to reproduce. Okay, because you have a greater access to resources. Just one example of how we study evolution occurring, natural selection occurring in species alive today. Another key piece of evidence for evolution is what we call homology. So homologous structures as well as molecular homology. So what we're talking about with homologous structures are structures that we see in related organisms that are similar but have acquired slight differences based on the unique natural selection trajectories of those organisms. Right, so let's take, for example, the forelimb of mammals. Most mammals have a forelimb where they have one big bone, two bones, many small bones, and then we have long small bones. And that same pattern was inherited by the ancestor of all of these mammals, right? Humans, cats, whales, bats, we all share a common ancestor way back in time that had a similar layout to big bone, two bones, tiny bones, long bones. Differences in the environment that these different groups of mammals lived in resulted in the slight differences in the structure of that organism. In whales even, they're living in a totally different environment. They're living in the water, but we still see that same basic pattern. Humerus, radius and ulna, carpals, metacarpals, and phalanges, right? So the same pieces, but through the process of natural selection, tinkering with those traits of having that basic pattern to their forelimb, it takes on a new shape. Okay, so same pieces, different shape, because they inherited that pattern of bone structure from their ancestor. And then on the other extreme in bats, right? So bat has those same bones, but they take on a new shape because this bat now lives in an environment that's selected for flight. Okay, so their metacarpals and phalanges are now used to support a really thin skin membrane that allows them to create their wing. Okay, so same basic pieces, but due to differences in the environment, natural selection has tinkered with, altered those structures for those organisms to be better fit for that environment. We can also see homology reflected in what we call vestigial traits or vestigial characteristics. Okay, so these are remnants from the ancestor, from the shared ancestor that this organism has with other organisms that are no longer functioning or might be marginally functional, right? So for example, cetaceans, whales. Whales are most related to even-toed ungulates, ungulates with two toes, things like deer. So their ancestor had 4 legs, and we can see tiny little remnants of those leg bones in their pelvis right here, right? So we found fossils that have tiny little leg bones, and even in modern day whales, we can still find these tiny little leg bones. They're there, they're non-functional, but they also don't harm the organism. They don't have any sort of negative impact on the organism's ability to survive, right? So they're kind of like evolutionary leftovers that give us a clue as to the evolutionary history of that organism. Humans have a ton of vestigial traits in us, right? So that little like pink little membrane right here in the middle of our eye, that's a dictating membrane. If you've seen a reptile, or they have sometimes a clear eyelid that they can put over their eyes, that's what's left over from that, right? We have a tiny little dictating membrane because we do share a common history or a common ancestor with reptiles at one point in time. Okay, wisdom teeth is another one. I'll post a video that's all the vestigial traits that you can find on us as humans. We can also have, so that's anatomical homologous structures. There's also molecular homology, similarities in DNA between otherwise we would think not very related organisms, right? Similarities in the proteins that are produced because of that shared DNA. We share on average about 85% of DNA in common with dogs, right? 44% of our DNA is similar to that of a fruit fly. So similarities in DNA show us that there's got to be some shared ancestry there at some point in time. Even though we might not look very similar today, billions of years ago, we definitely shared a common ancestor. The flip side of homologous structures is analogous structures or analogous features. These are characteristics that arise in organisms not due to shared ancestry, but due to similar environments. So here we have on the left, this is a cacti, and on the right we have a euphorbia. So these are organisms that look very similar. They have similar structures. There's big, long, thin stems here, and then their leaves are spines. Similar thing here. Big, long stems, and their leaves are spines. But these similarities are not due to the fact that they share a common ancestor. Similarities in cacti and euphorbs are analogous structures, meaning that they evolved these structures independently. Natural selection selected for those characteristics independently in cacti, and then separately independently in these euphorbs. Because they lived in a similar environment. They live in a dry, arid environment that's really hot, where water is a scarce resource. And so this structure of storing water in the stem and the spines to protect it, natural selection settled on that very similar adaptation to survive in that environment. Okay, so similar due to similar environment, not due to inheriting that characteristic from a shared ancestor. So we talked about Cuvier previously, and he was kind of the father of paleontology, and he started to recognize that there are some similarities between organisms. There are also some differences, even though he didn't believe that organisms changed, right? But the fossil record is a huge source of evidence for evolution. By putting together the tracing the changes in fossils within related organisms throughout time, we can see how these organisms are changing throughout time. So for example, here we have again the cetaceans, the whales. We can see most related species that are alive today would be the even-toed ungulates and the hippopotamuses. But for a long time, we didn't realize that. There was very little evidence as to how whales were related to the rest of mammals. It was kind of like a big black box that we didn't know much about. But the discovery of some fossils was that we were able to kind of piece together how this transition happened. How did these even-toed ungulates end up, basically, some branch of them ending up as whales, right? So we can kind of see through these fossilized features how the anatomy, the structures of these organisms change throughout time, which can lead us to see, okay, so here we still have a back leg. Now this back leg is a little bit more like a flipper. And by the time we get down here, for this extinct branch, that leg's basically gone. It might have a little nub on the outside, okay? To what we have today, the current cetacean, where we have basically just the pelvis left behind and none of these other leg bones. So it gives us a little peek into how species have changed over time. Even if they're not around anymore today, some of those ancestral traits would have been inherited by the current species, the extant species of today. So we can also use the study of biogeography as a major line of evidence for evolution. And this biogeography looks at the geographical distribution of species and their fossils to make predictions about where we would find current day species, or based on the current distribution, where we think we would find fossils of those species, right? So for example, this flower right here, its current distribution is labeled here in red, and we can see if we were to take these continents, zoom back 220 million years in time, that makes sense. That's how they were connected 220 million years ago, right? Here's Asia, here's Australia, here's Africa, here's South America. And South America and North America aren't really connected yet. Okay, so there's that little bit of connection, but it makes sense that we wouldn't find them in North America today, because in this current orientation, North America and South America aren't really connected together, per se, right? So they would have some sort of barrier to their being distributed on North America. So we can use the distribution of fossils to kind of predict where we would find current versions of species and vice versa. Okay, so based on where we find these organisms, we can then determine, okay, how either these continents were connected in a certain way, and therefore the species arose at a certain time when the continents were connected in that way. This idea of biogeography also helps to explain how organisms that are found on islands are related to their mainland species, and endemic species, so species that are only found on one specific island. Most species that are found on an island, say Darwin's finches, or plants that are only found on one island, for example, they're going to be most closely related to the nearest landmass. Okay, they're going to share most of their traits with those organisms on the nearest landmass. But the organisms found on the island that are endemic, meaning they're only found on one island, are going to have unique characteristics that allow them to survive on that certain island itself and the environment that exists on that island. So looking at how land masses change over time and how species are spread out over time, we can make predictions about their fossils and their relatedness to each other.